Hello, everyone, and welcome to the week one review where we will be reviewing your reflection activities for the week. I'll go through some of the answers that the class was able to present, add in a little bit of my own context and perspective, and we'll go ahead and move forward from there. So, this should be a good way for you to sort of look at the answers that you had submitted, where your answers line up with what I'm talking about in the rest of the class, maybe some ideas that you had that weren't presented here. And if there was something that maybe we're talking about that you didn't think of, you can go ahead and use that to say, okay, maybe coming up for the future assignments and so forth, that's something that I want to consider. So definitely, please try to use this as a learning tool moving forward. So our question here is really asking you to think about history itself. Think about why people study history, what kinds of information that studying history can provide us with, and why studying history is important. Overall, I thought the class did a really good job answering this. I thought there was a lot of good sort of deep dive thinking about sort of the meaning of history, a lot of very good examples that people brought up as far as the kinds of information that history can provide us with. And why sort of history to a lot of people is meaningful in different ways. So overall, fantastic job with these answers. So let's go through them one by one. So why do you think humans study history? A lot of people came up with the idea that history repeats itself. That if you look at sort of events in the past, you're going to see similar events occurring time and time again. And that based on that, you can sort of learn the lessons of the past. That each of these sort of examples of history repeating itself sort of gives you an opportunity to learn what things went well, what things didn't go well, what aspects served some people and led to good outcomes, and what ones didn't. Maybe some examples are, well, maybe this was good for a few people, but not good for a lot of people. So those are all sort of examples of people bringing forward this idea of learning the lessons and of history repeating itself. Um, I oftentimes say something similar. I say that history doesn't repeat itself, but people often do. The idea that there's never going to be another Roman Empire, for example, that so much of history is bound up in specific historical context that no, you're not going to see history itself repeating itself. But the fact that people, given similar circumstances, similar pressures, similar questions, and facing similar decisions, are going to act in very similar ways. And I think that's what really gives that perception that history is repeating itself, because a lot of times humans are going to act in very similar ways. One of the students, as far as the idea of learning the lessons of the past, brought up a good example that they had heard from a previous teacher of theirs, that studying history is sort of like watching someone else touch a hot stove. The idea that, yep, oh, they got burned doing that, so we should probably learn a lesson there. I like that a lot. Thank you for sharing that. I had not thought of it in those terms before, but to a certain degree, I think that is one way that you can definitely sort of use the past. Trying to learn those lessons. I think overall it's a very noble goal. I think it's a very good idea. But teaching history for quite a while and just viewing the world and the way people operate, I'm very somewhat skeptical now about how good we are actually at doing that. I think it's something that a lot of people would agree on the concept of, but when it's actually time to put it into practice, I think we have a much more difficult time. I think one reason for this is that oftentimes it seems that people have a very tough time admitting that they or their culture or their people had ever made a mistake. My point is you can't learn from a mistake if you just refuse to admit making any. So I think you really have to think about this, and we'll talk about this more in future questions about bias and so forth. You really have to think about we have to look at both the positives and negatives of history if you really want to try to learn anything from it. You can't just look at the bright, glowing, good parts, because it makes you completely unable then to learn any lessons from the bad parts, or the things that you could say, well, that didn't serve very many people very well, or did end up having some very catastrophic consequences. At the same point in time, you can sort of do it to the opposite side, maybe not trying to avoid negative things, but trying to see, well, what worked well in the past, and apply it for today. This can be just sort of, general ideas of governance or sort of how cultures operate or how religions operate. It could also be a lot more specific. For example, looking at the COVID-19 outbreak, coronavirus, a lot of the early attempts to try to figure out how to combat it were done by historians and medical experts looking at the 1919 pandemic, which ultimately had a lot of very negative consequences for a lot of people because of how the virus was spread and how it was handled and so forth. So trying to look at that example because they saw, well, this is the clearest parallel that we can see to the current situation, and trying to figure out how to do things differently or better to not have the same outcome of the very sort of large death tally that ended up having. Also, another good example of this, I'd say, would be back in the Great Depression. The Department of Agriculture, to try to combat the Dust Bowl, went back and utilized shelter belt technology, which had been developed by the Mesopotamians, some of the very first agricultural people on the planet, over 3,000 years ago, to try to combat and implement that technology and try to combat the Dust Bowl. So you can also pick out very specific examples of history, people saying, oh, this is something that either worked or didn't work well. Let's figure out what those things are and actually start implementing them here in the present. A lot of people also brought forward the idea that it's very difficult to understand anything in the present without understanding its history or its past. And that's another reason to very much why humans study history, is to just sort of understand what is going on in the world today. Another reason that people brought up was the personal connection that a lot of people have to history. For a lot of people, it's a very intimate connection that you have to your ancestors, to the people who came before you, and that exploring that connection is definitely a big reason that people are interested in history. It's no surprise that sites like Ancestry.com or Genealogy.com and this sort of modern technology and resources to kind of get a more personal view of where you specifically came from have really blown up over the last decade or so, because people are really interested in their own personal history. You know, where did my ancestors come from? What kind of lives did they live? And it's very interesting when you have that sort of knowledge of generally where your people came from, to think about, well, what kind of life did they live? How did they live different lives than I did? I'm learning about a historic event that they would have lived through. How might have this impacted them? And I think it makes it a lot more personal for people, which also is another reason why I think people study history. And for some of us, history is just really fun and interesting. To a certain degree, it's a form of communication. It's the only way that we can communicate with the peoples of the past. And also, it's a story to a certain degree as well. And people who like good and interesting stories can find a lot of really valuable things in studying the past. So I think those are all very good reasons that people brought up to one degree or another to think about why we like to study history. So what kind of information can the study of history provide us with? And a lot of people, brought this up to varying degrees. I think the one overarching theme you can use for this answer was context. The who, what, where, when, and most importantly, why questions. I like to think of this contextual piece as like puzzle pieces. Think about you're putting together a puzzle, and every time you can sort of link something in, one event, one person, into the sort of puzzle, you're sort of filling out the different pieces and seeing how they relate to each other, how they fit in with each other, and so forth. So those are kind of like sort of concrete kinds of information that the study of history can provide us with, which leads very well into why you think history is important. And to a certain degree, once more, a lot of people had the idea of it has a lot to do with perspective. Sort of seeing all those various puzzle pieces that the context and the information provides allows you to see a much clearer picture, right? When you're putting together a puzzle, you step back, you see, whatever kind of picture you're trying to put together, and the more puzzle pieces you have in place, the clearer picture you're going to have. And I think to a certain degree, it's impossible to understand the world that we live in today without understanding the past. That you're not going to be able to look at any people, any location, any conflict, and have a real clear idea of what's going on, why it is formed, and taking it forward from there, how to possibly find solutions if you don't have some concept of how we got to the point where we are today. And sort of back up to the idea of learning those lessons, hopefully taking what we have learned, what this context and perspective has shown us to try to improve the present, to solve these present problems, and to hopefully, if we're good at it, to create a better future. So this question asks you to look a little bit at periodization. Essentially, periodization is an organizational tool. It allows historians to break up the past into different time periods or blocks of time, which in some way, shape, or form share similar characteristics. Um, so if you want to think of history as a story, periodization can kind of be considered like a type of framing device, if that makes sense to people with more of a literary background. It's really there to try to break things down into manageable portions to think about. I mean, if you're talking about human history, you might be talking about hundreds of thousands of years. You're talking about the history of just looking at specific civilizations. You might be talking about thousands of years, and even talking about just the history of our country. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of years, and without some type of way to sort of break those time periods into more manageable chunks, it gets very unwieldy in order to try to think about them. Some examples when I'm talking about periodization you might think of would be something like the Neolithic time period, or the Bronze Age, the 16th century, or even talking about something like the 1960s. Those are all ways that we sort of say there were relatively similar things going on in these times in certain locations, and that's why we are going to try to use those as terminology for talking about specific time periods. So what are some of the benefits of periodization? Well, it really helps provide context for discussions and helps historians understand where individuals and events fit in. It helps us, like I said, in sort of that discord, to relate to one another, to know exactly, okay, I know generally what time period this is happening, generally what was going on. Now let's see how this person or event fits in with that sort of larger construct. And without periodization, it would really make discourse and conceptualizing history more difficult. So it very much is sort of used as a tool to make the study of history a little bit easier. But there's definitely some problems of periodization, and no form of periodization, I would say, is really without its flaws. First of all, that you need to realize that periodization is arbitrary and really only reflects a tool that's being used and not necessarily the reality in which people were living. A really good example of this is the Renaissance. A lot of times historians have used the Renaissance to talk about a time period spanning hundreds of years where there was a sort of artistic and cultural flourishing within Europe. But the Renaissance, when you're talking specifically about sort of the expansion of art and intellectualism and humanism and so forth, was really pertained and only affected a very relatively small amount of people within Europe. Maybe less than 10% actually came into contact with this artwork or these ideas or really even saw the effects of the Renaissance, which means for most people, the Renaissance didn't reflect their reality. If you went back in time and just talked to someone on the street, most people would have no idea that they were living through this sort of great time period that is often sort of referred to. So it didn't reflect their reality. And that's something as a historian you have to realize, that even though we are trying to use these sort of common elements, or maybe not common, maybe sort of elements that stand out during a particular time period, that doesn't necessarily mean that people living at that time were aware of it, they were actually being influenced by it at all, or that it was really having any kind of impact on their lives. There can also be a lot of outliers which don't neatly fit into these sort of arbitrary categories which are being created, which oftentimes might lead to more confusion, rather than trying to make the discourse easier. If you're talking about something that sort of fits outside of what typically defines a time period, it might make things more difficult rather than less difficult when discussing it. Periodization in history, as a discipline, also has the problem of being very Eurocentric. up until this point in time. We're trying to change that. It's getting somewhat better. But using periods which might make sense in European history a lot of times doesn't make sense when discussing history from any other peoples around the world. A really good example of this is thinking about something like the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages in Europe was this time period after the collapse of the Roman Empire, where there was a lot of decentralization, population levels went down. Typically a lot of people in history, thought about that time as where there was sort of a regression, if you want to think about it that way. There's been various ways that historians have rethought that time period since, but that has sort of been the traditional understanding of what the Dark Ages were. Now, that works fine for Europe, but if you're referring to the Dark Ages, you can't use that to refer to a location like the Middle East or China, where there was tons of cultural flourishing going on during this time period, where there was all very strong economies, interconnected economies, where empires and kingdoms were thriving and expanding, and trying to refer to those time periods as the Dark Ages makes absolutely no sense. It's a term that only really relates and reflects to what was going on in Europe. That's a term that has since, very much come under alteration. You're not going to see it used, and certainly you're not going to see it used referring to other cultures anymore because we've sort of learned that lesson. But that's just one example in the past of where periodization has made sense in one context, in one location, but not in another. So like I said, to a large degree, historians are trying to sort of move away from this, but it's still something we need to be aware of when we are talking about these various time periods, that they might not necessarily be reflective of all people at all times, and that you still need to think about and look at the historical um, um, people and things we're looking for and on an individual basis. And even though you might be able to use some contextual information for what's going on, that might not be a perfect tool. For our next question, I'd like to thank everyone for just taking a really good look at yourselves, um, your culture, your beliefs, and trying to acknowledge how that is going to be forming some of the biases that you are coming into the semester with. Um, as you talked about in the video and in the notes on history, everyone has bias. It's nothing to be ashamed of, even though kind of the term bias has a rather negative connotation. It's just something that simply exists, just as like we've all been enculturated into a particular culture, of particular beliefs. We've come up with some of our own ideas as we move through life. These are all things that are going to be impacting the way that we just perceive the world around them. So it's completely natural. So thank you so much for taking the time to think about some of these going into the semester. To a large degree, just simply acknowledging what helps inform your perception of the world goes a really long way to identifying your bias. A lot of you identify just how your gender, ethnicity, religion, political views, sexual orientation, health, and age, they all factor into how we perceive the world around us, and invariably then are going to impact how we perceive the past. One good example that some of you brought up was that just living in our current time period with the internet and cell phones and all the modern technology we have can really impact how we view the past. It can be really difficult, especially for people who grew up with all of these things around them and at their fingertips, to think about how people even survived before all these modern conveniences. And that really need to take that into account when considering the past, because perhaps past decisions might seem very odd to us today, whereas maybe they'd make very much sense within the context of not having sort of the same access to communication and information and communication that we have today. I think a lot of times the idea of miscommunications which occurred in history can seem somewhat odd to students today, simply because a lot of times those things could be cleared up with an easy phone call or text message or something like that, and realizing that, well, no, Julius Caesar couldn't simply text his friends in Rome and see if there was a plot out to get him, so he had to instead bring his entire army along with him, is something that, you just have to get into that mindset that the world that we live in today is very different than the world that most of the people we are going to be studying throughout the semester have lived in, and that certainly is going to impact the way that we view them, but it's something I think that once more we just have to very much keep in mind. So moving into the semester, just remember a couple things about bias. First of all, Everyone has a bias, and that being aware of your biases is an important aspect in determining how you are learning about the past. And while you cannot and should not try to eliminate your biases, neither should you allow them to hinder your ability to learn. Um, you know, Rather, purposely thinking about how your biases are causing you to react to and think about the information can be a really powerful tool. So just the more aware of your own biases you are, the more I think you can be in tune with why and how you're learning the information. Um, at the same point in time, our perspectives are always changing and they're always evolving as we receive more information. That just happens in anything in our daily life. So don't be afraid if you find some of your perceptions changing, as that is really a natural part of learning and the learning process. As many of you related in your answer, primary sources are vitally important to the study of history. Really, without primary sources, we would not have a discipline. Primary sources allow us to get first-hand accounts, or as close to first-hand accounts as possible. So, journals, diaries, letters, artifacts, newspapers, photographs, paintings, videos, government records, even buildings, can all provide direct information from the past. And that's really what constitutes a primary source, something that is close to time and proximity of something you are studying, or as close in time and proximity as you can get. And really, all these different kinds of sources can be incredibly important and useful in their own right, depending on what it is that's being studied. Also, trying to get a broad set of sources is very important, as many of you also brought up in your answers the impact that bias has on historical sources. Of course, bias works on a couple different levels. Besides the biases that we all bring into history when we're observing it and learning it, all primary sources were also created by someone from a particular culture, in a particular location, bringing into the creation of that source their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own cultural ways of knowing. And therefore, all primary sources also contain some level of bias. Now, some contain more than others. For example, a propaganda poster is going to be more biased and more biased a source than, let's say, a stone tool. Um, but it's just important to realize that to factor in not only our own biases, but the biases of the sources as well. So trying to obtain sources that provide multiple points of information and multiple viewpoints is very important no matter what the topic is that you are studying. Now, I would encourage everyone, whether you completed the metacognition question or not, to keep the following questions in mind as we move into the semester. Trying to identify how and why you are learning can make the learning process much easier, much more efficient, take you less time, and so forth. So, for example, if you can identify that you are a better visual learner, perhaps you want to start each week by watching the videos and then move on to the written portions with some previous knowledge, making it more easy to understand what's happening in the textbook or the PowerPoint. If you know that writing the reflection activities was difficult for you and took a lot of time, maybe you can schedule more time to complete those activities or contact the college's tutoring service or writing center for assistance on these assignments. All of this is valuable information and will help you learn more effectively, moving into the semester. So particularly the first few weeks here, I'd spend a decent amount of time at least thinking about this at the end of every week. And of course, if you come up with an idea that there might be something I can do to help you learn better or more effectively or more efficiently, feel free to reach out and let me know, because that's main reason I'm here. And I would love to have a conversation and discussion with you.